In the autumn of 1840, the city of Savannah carried itself with the peculiar elegance that marked the antebellum South. Moss-draped oaks lined the cobblestone streets, and the Savannah River moved with its eternal rhythm past the grand mansions of Factor's Walk. Among these homes stood the Witmore estate, a three-story Georgian structure on Bull Street, distinguished by its wrought iron balconies and towering columns. The house belonged to Theodore Witmore, a cotton merchant whose wealth had grown substantial through his dealings with the plantations that sprawled across the Georgia lowlands. The Witmore household operated with the calculated precision expected of a family of standing. Theodore, approaching 50 years of age, maintained strict schedules for both family and servants. His wife, Catherine Witmore, 20 years his junior, devoted her days to the social obligations demanded of her station. Their son, William Witmore, 22 years old, had recently returned from his studies at the College of Charleston with aspirations toward the law. The family employed 18 individuals in various capacities, from field hands at their rural properties to domestic staff within the city residence. Among the house servants was a young woman known as Mary Ellen Green. Records from the Chatham County Courthouse indicate she was approximately 23 years of age in 1840, though the exact date of her birth remains undocumented. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing remarkable beauty, with features that drew attention even in a household where such notice could prove dangerous. She had been purchased 3 years prior from an estate sale in Charleston, acquired specifically for her skills in needlework and her ability to read, an unusual accomplishment that made her valuable for managing household correspondence. Mary Ellen's daily responsibilities included tending to Catherine Witmore's wardrobe, maintaining the second-floor chambers, and assisting with the endless social correspondence that filled the mistress's afternoons. Visitors to the Witmore home frequently commented on the young woman's grace and intelligence, observations that were recorded in several diary entries discovered decades later. One such entry, found in the papers of a family friend, noted that Mary Ellen seemed to move through the house like a shadow, present but somehow separate from the world around her. The peculiar dynamics of the Witmore household first became apparent in the spring of 1840. Neighbors began to observe changes in the family's routine. William Witmore, who had previously been seen walking the squares and visiting with other young men of his acquaintance, began spending increasing amounts of time within the confines of the family residence. His mother's social calendar, once filled with afternoon visits and charity work, grew noticeably sparse. Theodore Witmore's business associates reported that he appeared distracted during meetings, often cutting conversations short to return home. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, whose residence sat adjacent to the Witmore property, later provided testimony to local authorities regarding the unusual sounds that began to emanate from the house during evening hours. According to her account, recorded in a sworn statement dated October 15, 1840, she frequently heard what she described as voices raised in heated discussion coming from the upper floors of the Witmore home. These conversations, she noted, seemed to occur with increasing frequency as the summer progressed. The Witmore family's attendance at St. John's Episcopal Church, previously regular, became sporadic during this period. Reverend Dr. Samuel Morrison, who maintained detailed records of parish activities, noted in his weekly reports that the family missed services on 4 consecutive Sundays in July and August of 1840. When they did appear, parishioners observed that Catherine Witmore seemed pale and withdrawn, while her son William displayed an agitation that was uncharacteristic of his previously calm demeanor. Local merchants who regularly conducted business with the Witmore household reported changes in the family's purchasing patterns. Orders for certain household items, particularly food supplies, increased significantly during the summer months. James Crawford, who operated a general store on Bull Street, later testified that Theodore Witmore personally visited his establishment on multiple occasions to purchase items that would normally have been ordered by the house servants. These purchases, Crawford noted, often included unusual quantities of lamp oil, candles, and various household tools. The isolation that seemed to settle over the Witmore residence became more pronounced as autumn approached. Social visits, which had once been a regular feature of Catherine Witmore's routine, ceased almost entirely. The family's correspondence, typically managed through Mary Ellen's assistance, dwindled to essential business matters only. Delivery boys and tradesmen reported that their interactions with household staff became increasingly brief and formal. Dr. Marcus Fielding, who served as the family physician, documented several visits to the Witmore home during this period. His medical journal, preserved in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, contains entries describing treatments for what he termed nervous complaints, affecting both Catherine and William Witmore. The physician noted that the family's requests for his services often came at unusual hours, typically in the evening or early morning. The servants employed in the Witmore household during this time displayed a remarkable reluctance to discuss their experiences. Even decades later, those few who eventually provided testimony to authorities spoke in guarded terms about the atmosphere within the house. Sarah Washington, who worked as a cook, described the summer and autumn of 1840 as a period when the very walls seemed to hold their breath. She noted that conversations among the staff were conducted in whispers, and that certain areas of the house, particularly the upper floors, were avoided whenever possible. Thomas Jenkins, who served as a groundskeeper for the property, observed that the family's habits regarding the house itself underwent significant changes. Windows that had previously remained open during the warm months were kept shuttered. Rooms that had been regularly used for entertaining guests remained closed and unused. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, began to show signs of neglect as resources and attention were directed elsewhere. The financial records of the Witmore family, examined years later during estate proceedings, revealed several unusual expenditures during this period. Large sums were paid to contractors for modifications to the house, though the specific nature of these changes remained unclear. Additional payments were made to individuals whose names appeared nowhere else in the family's business dealings, suggesting services of a discreet nature. Local law enforcement of the era, such as it existed, consisted primarily of a city watch and volunteer constables. Their records from 1840 show no formal complaints lodged against the Witmore family, though several incident reports mention disturbances in the vicinity of Bull Street during evening hours. These reports, typically dismissed as routine neighborhood disputes, later gained significance when viewed in aggregate. The autumn of 1840 brought with it a series of events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Witmore family's story. On a humid evening in early September, according to multiple witness accounts, screams were heard emanating from the direction of the Witmore residence. Mrs. Thornton, whose testimony had previously established the pattern of unusual sounds, reported that these particular cries were of such intensity that she sent her own servant to inquire about the well-being of the family. The servant, upon approaching the Witmore residence, was turned away at the door by Theodore Witmore himself, who appeared disheveled but insisted that no assistance was required. He explained that a member of the household had suffered an injury, but that the family physician had already been summoned. Dr. Fielding's records confirm that he was indeed called to the residence that evening, though his journal entry for the date contains only the cryptic notation, "Treatment provided, patient stable, discretion essential." In the days following this incident, the behavior of the Witmore household staff underwent a marked change. Several long-term employees gave notice and departed without explanation. The replacements hired in their stead were exclusively individuals with no prior connections to the local community, often recent arrivals to Savannah who possessed no established social networks through which information might spread. Mary Ellen Green's presence in the household during this period became increasingly difficult to verify through external observation. Neighbors who had previously noted her movements about the property reported that she seemed to have vanished from sight entirely. When questioned directly, members of the Witmore family provided varying explanations for her absence. Catherine Witmore told visitors that Mary Ellen had been sent to assist with relatives in the countryside. Theodore Witmore informed business associates that she had been sold to a family relocating to Alabama. William Witmore, when pressed by acquaintances, claimed to have no knowledge of Mary Ellen's current whereabouts. The contradictory nature of these explanations began to generate discussion within Savannah's social circles. While direct questioning of a family's domestic arrangements would have been considered improper, the inconsistencies did not go unnoticed. Several prominent families began to limit their social interactions with the Witmores, citing various polite excuses for declining invitations and avoiding reciprocal visits. Father Michael O'Brien, who ministered to the Catholic community within Savannah, later provided testimony regarding a conversation he had with Mary Ellen Green in the weeks prior to her disappearance from public view. According to his account, she had approached him after evening services at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, seeking guidance on what he described as matters of conscience involving her position in the Witmore household. Father O'Brien noted that Mary Ellen appeared distressed and spoke of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The priest's testimony, recorded in church documents that surfaced many years later, included Mary Ellen's statement that she feared for her safety but felt unable to seek help through conventional means. She had expressed concern that her legal status as property made any complaint she might lodge ineffective, and that speaking out could result in punishment not only for herself, but for other members of the household staff. Father O'Brien reported that he had offered to speak with Theodore Witmore on her behalf, but that Mary Ellen had declined, stating that such intervention would only worsen her situation. As autumn progressed into winter, the Witmore residence took on an increasingly fortress-like character. Deliveries were accepted only at the rear entrance, and visitors were discouraged through a variety of polite but firm refusals. The family's participation in community events ceased entirely, with Theodore citing business pressures and Catherine claiming recurring illness as explanations for their withdrawal from social obligations. The servants who remained in the household during this period later described an atmosphere of constant tension. Meals were taken in silence, and movement through the house followed strict patterns designed to minimize contact between family members and staff. Certain rooms were declared off-limits to all but the family themselves, and cleaning schedules were adjusted to ensure that domestic work occurred only when the family was absent from the immediate area. Dr. Fielding's visits to the residence became more frequent during the winter months, though his journal entries became increasingly cryptic. References appear to treatments for trauma of an undisclosed nature and consultations regarding psychological disturbances affecting multiple household members. As the physician also noted his growing concern about the isolation imposed upon the family and staff, writing that such seclusion was likely to exacerbate whatever underlying difficulties had created the need for his services. Local tradesmen and delivery workers began to report strange observations about the Witmore property during this period. Sounds of construction or renovation work were heard at unusual hours, typically during the night when such activities would normally be avoided. Smoke from the house's chimneys burned with an intensity and frequency that seemed excessive for the moderate Georgia winter. Lights were observed in windows of rooms that had previously appeared unused, suggesting that the family was occupying different areas of the house than had been their custom. The financial strain created by these various expenditures began to affect Theodore Witmore's business operations. Associates reported that he appeared increasingly desperate to complete transactions quickly, often accepting terms that were less favorable than he might have negotiated under normal circumstances. His attendance at the cotton exchange became irregular, and several profitable partnerships were allowed to lapse due to his failure to maintain regular communication. By early 1841, the Witmore family's position within Savannah society had deteriorated significantly. Invitations to social events ceased, and the family's name was gradually removed from the membership rolls of several prominent organizations. This social isolation, while not complete, effectively severed the connections that had previously provided the family with both economic opportunities and community standing. The spring of 1841 brought with it a development that would ultimately force the Witmore family's situation into the public eye. On March 23rd, according to records maintained by the Chatham County Sheriff, a runaway slave notice was filed by Theodore Witmore regarding Mary Ellen Green. The notice, which appeared in the Savannah Republican newspaper for 3 consecutive days, offered a substantial reward for information leading to her capture and return. The timing of this notice raised questions among those familiar with the family's previous explanations for Mary Ellen's absence. If she had indeed been sold to another family, as Theodore had claimed to some acquaintances, then filing a runaway notice would have been both inappropriate and legally questionable. The substantial reward offered suggested either that Mary Ellen possessed exceptional value to the family, or that her disappearance had created complications requiring immediate resolution. James Oglethorpe Harrison, who served as an informal advisor to several prominent Savannah families, later testified that Theodore Witmore had approached him seeking guidance on legal matters related to the recovery of stolen property. According to Harrison's account, Theodore appeared agitated and spoke of the urgent need to resolve the situation before it could develop into a larger problem. Harrison noted that Theodore's description of events seemed to shift during their conversation, with details becoming increasingly vague when pressed for specifics. The runaway notice generated significant discussion within the community, particularly among those who had observed the previous inconsistencies in the family's explanations. Several individuals came forward to report that they had seen Mary Ellen in the vicinity of the Witmore residence as recently as late February, contradicting the timeline suggested by the family's various statements about her departure. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, whose husband operated a successful shipping business, provided testimony indicating that she had observed Mary Ellen through the windows of the Witmore residence on multiple occasions during the winter months. According to her account, Mary Ellen's appearance during these sightings suggested that she was in poor health, appearing thin and moving with obvious difficulty. Mrs. Pemberton noted that these observations had prompted her to inquire about Mary Ellen's well-being, but that her questions had been deflected by Catherine Witmore with vague references to temporary illness. The investigation into Mary Ellen's disappearance, such as it was given the legal limitations of the era, was conducted primarily through informal inquiries among the community. Sheriff Joseph Hancock, whose jurisdiction covered Chatham County, interviewed several members of the Witmore household staff, but found their testimonies remarkably consistent in claiming no knowledge of Mary Ellen's current whereabouts. The staff uniformly stated that she had left the residence voluntarily, though none could provide specific details about the circumstances of her departure. Father O'Brien's involvement in the case became more prominent when he approached Sheriff Hancock directly to express his concerns about Mary Ellen's welfare. The priest's testimony provided the first detailed account of Mary Ellen's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance. His description of her fears and her sense of being trapped suggested that her absence from the Witmore residence might not have been voluntary, despite the family's claims to the contrary. The investigation took a significant turn when workers excavating for a new foundation in the vicinity of the Witmore property reported the discovery of personal items that appeared to have been buried deliberately. Among these items were pieces of clothing and jewelry that several witnesses identified as belonging to Mary Ellen. The location of this discovery, while not on the Witmore property itself, was close enough to raise serious questions about the circumstances of Mary Ellen's disappearance. Theodore Witmore's response to these discoveries was to increase his efforts to locate Mary Ellen through official channels. He petitioned local authorities to expand their search efforts and offered to provide additional resources for the investigation. This cooperation, while appearing helpful on the surface, struck some observers as an attempt to control the direction of the inquiry, rather than a genuine effort to resolve the mystery of Mary Ellen's whereabouts. The strain of the ongoing investigation began to manifest itself in the behavior of all members of the Witmore family. Catherine Witmore's health deteriorated significantly, with Dr. Fielding's records indicating treatments for what he described as nervous exhaustion of severe degree. William Witmore abandoned his legal studies and spent increasing amounts of time away from Savannah, claiming business obligations that required travel throughout the state. As spring turned to summer in 1841, the intensity of the search for Mary Ellen began to diminish. Official resources were limited, and without additional evidence pointing to criminal activity, the case began to receive less attention from authorities. The assumption that Mary Ellen had indeed run away, despite the inconsistencies in the family's account, gradually became accepted as the most likely explanation for her absence. The social consequences for the Witmore family, however, continued to mount. Several business relationships that had provided the foundation for Theodore's commercial success were terminated by partners who cited concerns about the family's reputation. The withdrawal of these partnerships created financial pressures that forced the sale of several properties, including some of the rural holdings that had been primary sources of income. Dr. Fielding's growing concern about the family's psychological state led him to recommend that they consider relocating to a different community where they might have the opportunity to rebuild their social connections. His medical opinion, documented in a letter to a colleague in Charleston, stated that the continuing stress of their situation in Savannah was preventing any possibility of recovery from whatever trauma had originally created their difficulties. The decision to leave Savannah was finalized in August of 1841. Theodore Witmore arranged for the sale of the Bull Street residence to a family recently arrived from Virginia. The transaction was completed quickly, with Theodore accepting an offer significantly below the property's estimated value in order to expedite the process. The proceeds from this sale, combined with the liquidation of other local assets, provided the resources necessary for the family's relocation. The departure of the Witmore family from Savannah occurred with little fanfare. They left on a morning in early September, traveling by carriage toward Augusta with the intention of eventually settling in Alabama, where Theodore claimed to have business prospects. Several members of the household staff accompanied the family, while others were provided with references and assistance in finding new positions within the community. The Bull Street residence stood empty for several months following the Witmore family's departure. The new owners, the Randolph family from Richmond, delayed their occupancy to allow for extensive renovations. During these renovations, workers made discoveries that would ultimately provide disturbing insights into the events that had transpired during the Witmore family's final months in residence. In a sealed room behind what had been the main pantry, Workers found evidence of recent habitation that appeared inconsistent with normal household use. The space, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, contained a makeshift bed, water basins, and other personal items. The room had no windows and could be accessed only through a concealed entrance behind built-in shelving. The conditions within the space suggested prolonged occupancy by someone who had been confined against their will. Among the items discovered in this hidden room were pieces of needlework that several former servants identified as Mary Ellen's handiwork. A diary, written in a hand that Father O'Brien confirmed matched Mary Ellen's writing from documents he had seen, contained entries dating from September 1840 through February 1841. The contents of this diary provided a detailed account of the circumstances that had led to Mary Ellen's confinement and the events that had transpired during her imprisonment. According to the diary entries, Mary Ellen's troubles had begun when she had witnessed something that the Witmore family considered dangerous to their reputation. The specific nature of this incident was described only in veiled terms, but the entries made clear that Mary Ellen's knowledge of these events had made her a threat that the family felt they could not allow to roam freely. The decision to confine her had been presented as a temporary measure, while they determined how best to address the situation. The diary documented the gradual deterioration of Mary Ellen's physical and mental health during the months of her confinement. Food was provided irregularly, and she was allowed out of the room only for brief periods during hours when visitors were unlikely to be present. The psychological impact of this isolation was evident in the progression of her writing, which became increasingly erratic as the months passed. The final entries in the diary, dated in late February 1841, expressed Mary Ellen's growing desperation and her determination to escape, regardless of the consequences. She wrote of having loosened some of the floorboards in her prison and of having begun digging beneath the house's foundation. Her plan, as described in these final pages, was to create a tunnel that would allow her to reach the outside without being detected by the family. The discovery of the diary and the hidden room prompted a renewed investigation into Mary Ellen's disappearance. Workers excavating beneath the house found evidence of the tunnel that Mary Ellen had described. The passage extended approximately 15 feet from the hidden room before emerging in the garden area behind the house. The tunnel was crudely constructed, but had been reinforced with pieces of wood and metal that Mary Ellen had somehow acquired during her confinement. The question of Mary Ellen's ultimate fate remained unanswered despite these discoveries. The tunnel provided a clear indication that she had indeed escaped from the Witmore residence, but there was no evidence of what had happened to her after she had reached the outside. The timing of her escape, based on the final diary entries, coincided with the period when the family had begun filing runaway notices and offering rewards for her capture. Father O'Brien provided additional testimony regarding conversations he had held with members of the local community during the months following Mary Ellen's disappearance. According to his account, several individuals had reported seeing a woman matching Mary Ellen's description in various locations throughout the region, but these sightings had been dismissed at the time as cases of mistaken identity. The discovery of the tunnel and diary suggested that at least some of these reports might have been accurate. The investigation into the Witmore family's activities during their final year in Savannah revealed a pattern of deception and control that extended beyond their treatment of Mary Ellen. Former employees provided testimony indicating that other members of the household staff had been subject to increasingly restrictive conditions, with movements monitored and communications limited. The atmosphere within the residence had become one of fear and suspicion, with trust between family members and servants completely eroded. Dr. Fielding, when questioned about his knowledge of Mary Ellen's confinement, acknowledged that he had suspected something unusual was occurring within the household, but had been unable to determine the specific nature of the problem. His requests to examine all members of the household had been consistently refused by Theodore Witmore, who had claimed that such examinations were unnecessary and would represent an intrusion upon family privacy. The financial records of the Witmore family, examined in detail during the investigation, revealed expenditures that now appeared connected to Mary Ellen's imprisonment. Large payments had been made for construction materials and services that had been used to create and maintain the hidden room. Additional expenses had been incurred for items that would have been necessary to sustain someone in confinement for an extended period. The legal ramifications of these discoveries were limited by the laws and social structures of the era. Mary Ellen's status as property meant that her confinement, while morally questionable, did not necessarily constitute a crime under the legal framework of 1841 Georgia. The deception practiced by the Witmore family in their public statements about her whereabouts was viewed as a private matter rather than a legal offense. The Randolph family, who had purchased the Witmore residence, decided to abandon their plans to occupy the property after the discoveries made during renovation. The house was subsequently sold to investors who converted it to commercial use, effectively ending its function as a private residence. The hidden room was permanently sealed, and the building's residential character was altered beyond recognition. Efforts to locate the Witmore family in their new location proved unsuccessful. Theodore Witmore had provided false information about his intended destination, and the family appeared to have assumed new identities after leaving Savannah. Several reported sightings in various southern cities were investigated, but failed to produce reliable confirmation of their whereabouts. Father O'Brien continued his efforts to determine Mary Ellen's fate for several years following the discovery of the hidden room. He corresponded with religious and community leaders throughout the region, providing Mary Ellen's description and seeking information about any young women who might have sought assistance or sanctuary. These efforts, while extensive, failed to produce any definitive information about her survival or death. The story of Mary Ellen Green became part of Savannah's local history, though the details were often altered or embellished in the retelling. The official records of the case were eventually archived with the county courthouse, where they remained largely forgotten for decades. The hidden room in the former Witmore residence became the subject of local legend, with various supernatural explanations offered for the events that had transpired there. In 1863, during the Civil War period, a woman claiming to be Mary Ellen Green approached authorities in Augusta, Georgia, seeking assistance in establishing her legal identity. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-40s, provided details about her imprisonment in Savannah that matched many of the facts that had been documented during the investigation. However, her physical appearance and some aspects of her account differed sufficiently from the earlier records to leave questions about the validity of her claims. This woman, regardless of her true identity, provided additional information about the circumstances of Mary Ellen's escape and the years that had followed. According to her account, Mary Ellen had survived her flight from the Witmore residence, but had been forced to live in hiding, constantly fearful that the family's agents might track her down. She had moved frequently throughout the region, working in temporary positions and avoiding any situation that might bring her to official attention. The testimony of this woman, recorded in documents that were later discovered in the archives of the Augusta courthouse, provided details about the specific incident that had originally prompted Mary Ellen's imprisonment. According to her account, Mary Ellen had witnessed William Witmore physically assaulting another member of the household staff, and her attempts to intervene had resulted in threats against her own safety. The assault, as described in this testimony, had resulted in serious injuries to the victim, who had subsequently died from complications related to the attack. Mary Ellen's knowledge of these events had made her a dangerous witness, and the family's decision to confine her had been motivated by their fear that she might provide testimony that would result in criminal charges against William. The decision to maintain Mary Ellen's confinement rather than simply disposing of her had been influenced by practical considerations. Her skills and knowledge made her valuable to the household, and Theodore Witmore had initially believed that her imprisonment would be temporary, lasting only until the family could relocate to a community where the incident would be unknown. The psychological impact of the prolonged confinement on all members of the household had been more severe than the family had anticipated. Catherine Witmore's declining mental health had been directly related to her knowledge of Mary Ellen's situation and her inability to intervene effectively. William Witmore's agitation and withdrawal had stemmed from his guilt regarding both the original assault and the subsequent imprisonment of the witness. Theodore Witmore's business difficulties had been partly self-inflicted, as his preoccupation with maintaining the secret of Mary Ellen's confinement had prevented him from giving proper attention to his commercial affairs. The family's social isolation had been both a consequence of their secretiveness and a strategy to minimize the risk of discovery. The woman who claimed to be Mary Ellen provided specific details about her escape that corresponded closely with the physical evidence that had been discovered in the hidden room and tunnel. According to her account, the escape had been planned over several weeks, with work on the tunnel conducted primarily during evening hours when the family was less likely to detect the sounds of digging. The most dangerous aspect of the escape had been the final emergence from the tunnel, which had required Mary Ellen to traverse the garden and reach the street without being observed. She had timed this phase of her escape to coincide with a social event that had drawn the attention of the household staff away from the rear areas of the property. Following her escape, Mary Ellen had initially sought refuge with sympathetic individuals within Savannah's free black community. However, the risk of discovery had forced her to leave the city within days of her escape. She had traveled primarily on foot, avoiding main roads and public transportation, until she had reached communities where her presence would be less likely to attract attention from those who might be searching for her. The years following her escape had been marked by constant vigilance and frequent relocations. Mary Ellen had been forced to assume different names and identities, often claiming to be a free woman whose papers had been lost or destroyed. The skills that had made her valuable to the Witmore household had enabled her to find work in various communities, though she had never remained in any location long enough to establish permanent connections. The psychological scars of her imprisonment had never fully healed, according to the woman's testimony. She described ongoing difficulties with confinement and enclosed spaces, as well as persistent fears about being discovered and returned to bondage. These psychological effects had influenced her decision to avoid seeking official assistance for many years, even after the legal framework surrounding slavery had begun to change. The verification of this woman's identity remained impossible given the limited documentation available from the original case. However, her detailed knowledge of events and her physical scars, which corresponded to injuries that Mary Ellen was known to have sustained, provided compelling evidence supporting her claims. The authorities who interviewed her found her account credible, though they were unable to take any action regarding the original crimes due to the passage of time and jurisdictional limitations. The fate of the Witmore family remained unknown even at the time of this woman's appearance in Augusta. Various rumors had circulated about their activities in other communities, but none had been substantiated through official investigation. The disruption caused by the Civil War had made tracking their movements even more difficult. as records from many communities had been lost or destroyed during the conflict. The legal status of the crimes that had been committed in Savannah presented complex questions that were never fully resolved. The confinement of Mary Ellen, while morally indefensible, had occurred within a legal framework that provided limited protections for enslaved individuals. The death of the household staff member, if it had indeed occurred as described, would have constituted a serious crime regardless of the victim's legal status, but the lack of contemporary documentation made prosecution impossible. The documentation of Mary Ellen's case, including the woman's later testimony, was eventually incorporated into the archives maintained by various historical societies and research institutions. These records provided valuable insights into the experiences of enslaved individuals and the methods by which their treatment was concealed from public scrutiny. The case became a subject of study for historians examining the dynamics of power and control within antebellum households. The physical location of the former Witmore residence continued to carry the weight of its history throughout the remainder of the 19th century. Despite its conversion to commercial use, the building was associated with the events that had transpired there, and various business ventures that occupied the space experienced difficulties that some attributed to the building's troubled past. In 1897, during renovations of the building for new commercial tenants, workers discovered additional artifacts that appeared to be connected to Mary Ellen's confinement. These items, including pieces of clothing and personal effects, were found in areas of the building that had not been thoroughly examined during the original investigation. The discovery of these materials led to renewed interest in the case and prompted efforts to compile a more complete historical record. The documentation process revealed that Mary Ellen's case had not been unique, though it had been unusually well documented due to the circumstances of its discovery. Research into the histories of other prominent Savannah families uncovered evidence of similar incidents involving the confinement and mistreatment of enslaved individuals. The methods used to conceal these activities from public view had often followed patterns similar to those employed by the Witmore family. The broader historical context surrounding Mary Ellen's case included the increasing tensions between different segments of Southern society regarding the institution of slavery. The incident had occurred during a period when public criticism of slavery was growing, particularly in urban areas where the contradictions between stated ideals and actual practices were more visible to outside observers. The economic pressures that had contributed to the Witmore family's difficulties were reflective of broader changes occurring in the Southern economy during the 1840s. The increasing competition from other cotton-producing regions and the growing influence of Northern financial institutions had created uncertainties that affected many families whose wealth had been built upon slave labor. The social dynamics that had enabled the Witmore family to maintain their secret for an extended period were also representative of broader patterns within antebellum society. The reluctance of neighbors and community members to interfere in the domestic arrangements of prominent families had created an environment in which abuses could occur without intervention. The role of religious institutions in addressing or failing to address such situations was exemplified by Father O'Brien's efforts on Mary Ellen's behalf. While individual clergy members might attempt to provide assistance, the institutional structures of the time often limited their ability to challenge the legal and social frameworks that permitted such treatment. The medical profession's complicity in concealing evidence of abuse was demonstrated through Dr. Fielding's involvement with the Witmore family. While the physician had suspected that inappropriate treatment was occurring, The professional and social constraints of the era had prevented him from taking effective action to investigate or intervene. The limitations of law enforcement in addressing crimes involving enslaved individuals were clearly illustrated by the investigation into Mary Ellen's disappearance. Even when evidence of wrongdoing was substantial, the legal framework provided few mechanisms for protecting victims or prosecuting perpetrators when the victims possessed no legal rights. The long-term consequences of such incidents extended beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities. The fear and suspicion that resulted from knowledge of hidden abuses created social tensions that undermined the stability of the institutions that had permitted such treatment to occur. The preservation of Mary Ellen's story through various forms of documentation served as a testament to the experiences of countless individuals whose suffering had been hidden from historical view. The detailed record of her confinement and escape provided insights into the daily realities of slavery that were often absent from official accounts of the period. The questions raised by Mary Ellen's case regarding the nature of human dignity and the responsibilities of society to protect vulnerable individuals remained relevant long after the specific legal and social structures that had enabled her mistreatment had been abolished. The moral complexity of the situation continued to challenge later generations, seeking to understand the historical foundations of their communities. Today, more than 120 years after these events transpired in Savannah, the location where the Witmore residence once stood bears no visible trace of its troubled history. The commercial buildings that now occupy the site serve the routine needs of a modern city, while beneath their foundations lie the remnants of a hidden room where a young woman once counted the days of her imprisonment. The tunnel through which Mary Ellen Green made her desperate escape has long since been filled and forgotten. But the questions raised by her story continue to echo through the corridors of history, reminding us that the silence imposed upon the powerless can never fully suppress the truth of their experiences. The records maintained by the Savannah Historical Society include a final entry dated October 12, 1968, when construction workers demolishing the last remnants of the old commercial building made one final discovery. Deep beneath the foundation, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow preserved it through more than a century, they found a small metal box containing Mary Ellen's original freedom papers, documents that had been hidden away during her confinement, representing the legal proof of her liberation that the Witmore family had suppressed. These papers, bearing the seal of a Charleston attorney and dated 6 months before her disappearance, revealed the most disturbing truth of all. Mary Ellen Green had been legally freed by her previous owner's will, making her imprisonment not merely cruel, but entirely illegal even by the standards of 1840. The Witmore family had purchased her knowing she was entitled to freedom, had concealed this fact, and had confined her specifically to prevent her from claiming her rightful status. The discovery prompted one final investigation, conducted by researchers from the University of Georgia, who had become interested in documenting the hidden histories of antebellum Savannah. Their work, completed in 1969 and archived with the Georgia Historical Society, concluded that Mary Ellen Green had most likely survived her escape and lived under an assumed name for many decades. Fragmentary records suggested she had eventually settled in Philadelphia, where a woman matching her description had operated a small seamstress shop until her death in 1891. The Witmore family's trail had gone permanently cold by 1865, when Theodore Witmore's name appeared on a list of Confederate sympathizers who had fled to Mexico following the end of the Civil War. No reliable records of the family's subsequent fate were ever located, though rumors persisted that William Witmore had died violently in a cantina fight in Veracruz sometime in the 1870s. The final report noted that Mary Ellen's case represented just one documented example of what researchers estimated might have been hundreds of similar incidents throughout the antebellum South. The difference lay not in the nature of her suffering, but in the unusual circumstances that had preserved the evidence of it for future generations to examine. The building site was eventually converted into a small memorial garden, though no plaque or marker indicates its connection to Mary Ellen Green's story. The City Planning Committee determined that such acknowledgement might prove unnecessarily divisive for a community still working to reconcile its past with its present aspirations. On quiet evenings in Savannah, when the Spanish moss hangs still and the air carries the weight of centuries, some residents claim they can still hear echoes from the past, not supernatural manifestations, but the simple, persistent reminder that some stories refuse to remain buried, no matter how deeply they are hidden, or how many years pass before they finally emerge into the light.